So we're going to move into the Renaissance now, and the Renaissance is actually cut up into three different periods, believe it or not. Most people, when they hear the Renaissance, they're going to think of Michelangelo, Da Vinci, and they're going to think of Raphael. Now, that actually happens in the High Renaissance, which is the last period of the Renaissance. The other two, it's called the Early Renaissance, the Mid Renaissance, and then, like I said, the last one is the High Renaissance. Don't ask me why they changed it and didn't call it the Late Renaissance. I honestly couldn't tell you. But it's mostly focusing on Italian artwork, and this is where we're really going to see a focus on the human body, and much like the Hellenistic period, very much so realistic aspects. Now, there is also Flemish, Germanic, French Renaissance going on at the same time, and we are also going to look at that, and as well as a different PowerPoint that I'm also going to post this week, which actually talks about what's going on in Asia during the Renaissance, because they're having their own Renaissance at the same time, which is really interesting, and most people don't get to think about or talk about when going over this sort of time period. And there's a huge shift yet again. Most of the times, whenever there's a declaration of a time period for art history, it's because of a huge shift within the canon. And this one really focuses on humanistic ideology. And what that really is artists are sitting around, and instead of sort of making work, well, they're still making religious work. And you're going to see that very prominent, especially in the High Renaissance. But also, they're depicting everyday people, much like the Hellenistic period from the Greek time, and they're depicting peasants. They're depicting what's going on every day, what they're seeing, people walking by. They're asking models now. Now, this is where it's going to be really interesting, because we see that there's models, and actually a little sort of morbidly interesting fact is that one thing that Michelangelo is actually really famous for, but not actually famous for outside of the art world, but what he's famous for inside the art world, is that at a very young age, he was actually digging up bodies to examine the human body and to really understand it, so that way he could depict it in a more realistic manner. And actually, he's not the only one that did that at his time. A lot of times, artists would get it legally. He did it illegally by grave robbing, in a way. And there's this sort of fascination that happens within artists of this period, where they really want to depict reality, and this is the time period in which they come up with perspective. So if you've ever taken an intro to drawing class, or if you haven't, the perspective is it's what makes a painting three-dimensional. But what's happening is that there's a horizon line and a vantage point, and everything leads to that vantage point. And that's like 1-point perspective. 2-point perspective, there's 2 vantage points, and everything leads to those 2 points on the canvas. And the reason why it's really important that they're starting to adapt to perspective is because you'll actually see the figures, as well as perspective taking place. The figures are going to be more realistic, and they're also going to be really focusing on the muscles and the flow of the body. So a lot of these are going to be nude. So we're going to see a lot of nudity again that's coming up. We're going to see very realistic. We're no longer going to really see those big heads on the short bodies that we saw in the Gothic medieval time period. But I mean, there's going to be a little bit of that reminiscence and overflow during the early Renaissance. Much like any time period and movement for art, it's sort of this slow thing. It doesn't just happen overnight. And particularly when we look at Germanic work, we're going to see also kind of this lingering of flatness. The perspective isn't quite there yet in the early Renaissance, which is what we're going to start with. We're going to start with the early Renaissance. We're going to move quite quick through it. We're going to move quickly through the mid-Renaissance, and then we're going to go over the High Renaissance in depth. And that's because that's mostly where we start to really think about the human body in art captured in an in-depth manner. So here is the first Finnish painter that we're actually going to look at. We're going to look at a couple, but here is the very first one. And his name is actually Robert Champin, and he's known as the Master Flamale. And this piece is Marode Altarpiece. And it's really important because with Flemish art and when we look at the Flemish works, we're here to focus on the human body, but just a little bit of background. Every single item in the picture painted is symbolic of something. Every single item. Now, that being said, when you look at this, there is a lot of items that we could be going over. I'm just going to briefly go over a couple, but very first, what I want to point out again is what we're looking at here. This is the first time that we're seeing, all right, let me backtrack a little bit. What we're seeing right now is the Annunciation of Mary, which is when the angel Gabriel comes down and he says to Mary, "You're going to bear a child even though you're a virgin." That's essentially the Annunciation scene. Now, in the past, it was always depicted within a church. There's, as if you remember from the Gothic art and from the medieval art, there were always halos. There was that yellowness around the heads. There was that flatness. Everybody had the same face. But if you actually look at what we're seeing here, every single person has their own identity. And there's no more halos. The only thing that gives away that who Gabriel is at all is the wings on his back. And actually what gives away that this is Mary is, again, those iconic objects that are around them within the room. Believe it or not, the white cloth in the background, and even the one that Mary is holding, is to actually symbolize that she is a virgin, that she is the pure Mary. And even the vase on the table is supposed to symbolize that she is the virgin. So there's a lot of different things that are going on. The candle that's no longer lit is actually, it's supposed to hint at the presence of the Holy Spirit to come. A lot of things get jam-packed into these paintings to indicate who these people are. So not only are these items telling you who these people are that you are now looking at, but also the fact that they are individuals tells you who you're looking at. The people to the left, so the left panel of this triptych, which a triptych is just like a paneling that depicts usually a religious subject matter that the patron would pay for, or the church, or any person could really pay for it. So this triptych, it has 3 panels. That's why it's called triptych. The try in there. The ones on the left are actually the patrons for this, and the reason why they're kneeling, and the reason why they're kneeling while they're opening this door is actually because it's supposed to imply that they are getting this religious vision that will bless them in their marriage to come. So that's also why this is taking place. The whole scene where Mary and Gabriel are is actually taking place in, at the time, a modern day Finnish house. So the surroundings of Mary and Gabriel are things that they would be very familiar with, things that would be lying around their houses. You know, what their house actually looked like on the inside, which was never done before. And the patrons are seeing this, and they're depicted as they are in a realistic manner. That is how they looked at the time period. It's not romanticized, it's not idolized. It's that is who they are. And they were actually painted in later. It's believed that actually the first panel was done during their sort of engagement, and then that panel was added on after the marriage. So if you also look at the dates, 1425 to 1430, it's not because we don't know when exactly the painting was painted. It's because paintings of this time did not come out within that year. They weren't just done right away. They were sort of a time period. It took a couple of years for one of these artists to actually finish the painting. And it wasn't because they weren't skilled, it was because a lot of detail was going into it and a lot of alterations and changes would happen. Especially if the patron didn't like it, they would have to repaint it. So that's kind of what we're seeing here is the patron is asking for this specific thing and they're depicting it in a way that was never done before. And like I said before, there is a vantage point in here. If you look at the table and the way that their perspective is, it is a 1-point vantage point. But if you actually look at the folds of the clothing and you look at the individuals, there is still some warping that we're seeing from the medieval and Gothic time period still leaking over. This is the early Renaissance. But the fabric and the shading is a drastic difference if you remember from the actual Gothic period. If you remember the Byzantine flatness that occurred. The head is not on one plane. It has some depth to it, some fleshiness to it. On the other side is Joseph working in his carpentry, and again, there's a lot of symbolism there. But once again, there's a 1-point perspective going on, and we see the human being working in there. We see the individual. He has a beard, unlike the patron who does not. He's wearing these drapery clothing. It has the shadows. It's catching the light. And actually, if you look at the clothing, the light source is actually coming from us. Where we are looking at the painting, that is the source of light shining onto the actual painting itself. So as we continue into the early Renaissance, one really important painter of the time is actually John van Eyck. And I really want to look at his work. Even though it's not really body-based, I feel as though it's really important just to understand sort of the movement and what was happening for the Renaissance time period. Especially because if you remember from the ancient and the Paleolithic and Neolithic time period and sort of those that came before, as we moved, we went from art having a function in relationship with the body and actually having this connection to the body, even though it wasn't portraying the body literally. And then as we moved into sort of the ancient Greek particularly, and just the ancient world in general, that sort of shifted from have a relationship with the body and holding a function to wanting to portray the body in an idealistic way and then in a realistic way. And then as we went into the medieval times, it's really important to remember and recall that that time period, art was no longer looking at a function with the body. It was no longer looking at the body, but it was now becoming the function and purpose of religion. And as we look at this portrait, now a lot of the Renaissance artwork is going to be depicting moments from Christianity specifically. And I really wanted to look at this portrait because I wanted to help everyone understand that it's not just about religion at this time period. This is also doing portraits, much like the patron from the earlier finished painting that we just looked at. This one had a patron. It was commissioned by somebody, and it's a little bit controversial about who really commissioned it. But if we look at the sort of symbols that's compacted into this painting, Van Eyck left us a lot of information to sort of unwrap and decide what is going on in this painting. And this painting actually, there's a little bit of controversy about whether or not this is true, but a lot of people believe, a lot of historians believe, that this painting in particular is a wedding certificate in a way, and that that's the painting's function, particularly because Van Eyck actually signs it in the back. He says, Van Eyck is here. That's what that little writing is above the mirror, which the mirror is that circular icon right in the center. And actually, if you look into the mirror, it's like a painting all on its own, which is amazing and astounding since it's so tiny in reality. But you see Van Eyck in the mirror, and his hand is actually up. Now, his hand could be just waving. It is believed that the portrait of Giovanni, who's an Italian merchant, who's they believe is depicted here, with his wife, is actually a friend of his. But the fact that he actually signed it believes that it could be a wedding certificate. And this could be his first wife, it could be his second wife, although a lot of documentation says that it's not his second wife, or it could be his cousin and his cousin's wife. And the fact that he signed it is actually really important because at this time, artists were not signing. If you remember from the ancient period and a lot of others, I didn't really emphasize or discuss the artist depicting or chiseling or painting a certain mural. It was mostly about the subject matter. And here we're going to shift and we're actually going to see an importance within the artist who is actually working on these pieces. So Van Eyck writes his name in this. He put himself in the portrait, and what the portrait is trying to depict is a little bit controversial, but again, if we look at the symbolism, the man is wearing darker clothing. So if it is his first wife, if it is Giovanni's first wife, then it would make sense because his first wife actually passed away trying to give birth. So again, that could be what's going on here. She does appear pregnant, but the wonders of the Renaissance time period is that they really mastered perception and perspective and sort of the folds and movement of light. And if you actually look carefully at this painting, she isn't actually pregnant. What's happening is the way that she's pulling up on her dress appears to be as if she is pregnant. So a lot of theories about this is whether or not it's hinting at his first wife who passed away trying to give birth, or if it's actually trying to be like a blessing to his first wife that she will give birth. And actually, the dog on the floor is a symbol of loyalty within the marriage. So again, if we're looking at this as a marriage certificate, there's a lot of symbolism going on that's unpacking, but at the same time, there's a lot of sort of mystery about it all, because if this occurred while his first wife was alive, then we don't really understand why he's wearing all dark clothing. And we don't really know why he would hint at her being pregnant instead of just portraying her as pregnant. There's sort of like this unanswered questions behind it. Now, on the mirror, there is the Stations of the Cross, which, if you don't know what the Stations of the Cross are, it's the movement of, or the telling of Christ's crucifixion. And that's around the mirror, which is interesting because we don't really know why he would do that, unless, again, it's hinting at his first wife's death and sort of her movement into the next stage of life, or what's believed to be the next stage of life for her. And again, there's sandals, and these sandals also hint at loyalty within a marriage, and as well as sort of trying to show prosperity and wealth. There's oranges sitting over there. That's also to represent this sort of purity. And this is what is happening at the time. There's like I said in the other painting, every single thing has a purpose, has a function within the painting. So paintings no longer have a function outside of still being religious icons, or for this case, a marriage certificate. Other than that, there's no more function, but they're becoming more detailed, more in depth, more realistic. They're paying attention to detail, they're paying attention to individuals, they're paying attention to the style of the time period that they are in, depicting the current era, which a lot of times I didn't even point out, but a lot of times in medieval artwork, it was actually depicting an era that was not current. So some big things about printmaking is that they really focus on sort of woodcuts and engraving, and engraving is believed to have come from metalsmiths. One in particular example of that is a German artist who his father was a metalsmith, and in order to record his data, he would sort of rub this sort of lamp black into an engraved lines and press it on the paper on a plate. And that's how he would record what he was doing throughout the day. And his son looked at that and inspired him to make engraving. So that's just one example. But what also kind of pushed along printmaking was definitely in the late end of the century, the 14th century, the printing press became a thing, and it was in full use at that point, maximum use at that point. But the one that we're looking at right here, he's actually an Italian artist. It's Antonio, and this is his Battle of the Nudes. Now, with the Flemish artists, a lot of the work that we were looking at, and a lot of Northern European sort of works, they're clothed, and the scene has a lot more detail in it, and the objects were a lot more detailed. And this is why I kind of started with that, even though we're looking at the human body. I really wanted to emphasize that because what's happening over in Italy is actually completely different in regards to the Renaissance. Both of them very striking, very realistic in manner, but over in Italy they don't look so much at the surrounding landscape as they are looking at the body. And this one in particular, in the Battle of the Nudes, it's actually one model that posed in all of these different positions that allowed Antonio to make this piece. And he's just studying the body, the male body, in tense, high tense, flexed positions where the muscles are all tightened to their fullest capacity. And that was sort of the study that was happening in this piece. He was trying to sort of master and understand the tension of the body, the sort of structure that the muscles take in these movements. So when most people think of the Italian Renaissance, they think of all of Italy, but that's not actually true. What we really want to focus on is the Papal States and actually Florence. Now, most of northern Italy actually has a huge influence during the Renaissance, and that's because that's where most of the money and wealth go to. So when I say I want to focus on Florence and the Papal States, it's mostly because during the Papal States are run by the Pope, and he commissions a lot of artwork at the time, and he wants a lot of artists during this time period, and he's actually a couple of them he's actually going to threaten in order to get into his area to bring art there. Now in Florence in particular, we have the Medici family, and the Medici family were bankers, and they were very, very wealthy. And not just one Medici individual, but many of the Medici members actually put money into and funneled money into not only the artists but the architecture. They were very big on art. They valued it. They thought that it was beautiful and a need in order to have a more beautiful city. So a lot of artwork is going to be coming out of Florence. It's going to be coming out of the Papal States. And those are the main areas in which the Italian Renaissance actually exists. When most people think of David, they think of Michelangelo's David. They think that that's the only David out there. But that's not true. A lot of the Davids actually came before and after Michelangelo's David. Now, what exactly is the David? It's a story from the Bible. It's a boy who takes down a giant using a slingshot. So, basically, what's happening here? Why did Donatello make this? Who is Donatello? Well, Donatello is not a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle. He is a sculptor from the Renaissance time period. He was actually commissioned to make this for the Medici family as a sign of victory from Florence over Milan. Now, again, if you go back to that map real quick, you'll notice that the Milan territory is up above and the Florence territory is down below. And it really wasn't the whole territory that the Medici family had actually conquered. It was only a tiny portion of it, but it was still enough for the Medicis to want a sculpture to sort of commemorate that. Now, a lot of people have controversy over this sculpture in particular, a lot of art historians. And the reason why is because this is the first male nude to be depicted since the ancient times. So, medieval times, they were all clothed sculptures. However, keep in mind, strictly Italian medieval sculptures were clothed. As I said, the Gothic period, you did see plenty of nudes. But that was not actually the Italian medieval ages. That was from Germanic descent. That being said, this being the first male nude since antiquity was kind of a striking movement for Donatello to do. It was sort of a daring move, if you'd say, because it wasn't acceptable anymore. It wasn't socially acceptable. But here we see a socially acceptable male nude. And again, most Italian Renaissance artists are focusing on the male nude because they're more interested in depicting reality of the human body itself. Now, some art historians say that the pose that Donatello is actually in, or that David is actually in, isn't because Donatello wanted to depict a realistic male and put him in that pose, but to actually have some hints of homoerotic undertones. Now, that's not necessarily true. The body in that pose could also depict the sort of playfulness of a young boy taking on the responsibility of a mature adult. So, looking at this body, there's kind of several different takes that you could go on with the figure's actual physical pose. At the bottom line is, he chose to depict David completely naked, which wasn't done in many years before. So, that being said, we get to actually see the physical human body in a sculpture once again since the ancient time period, and it's no longer rigid, but we can also see the contrapposto showing up again. Now, keeping in mind a lot of Florentine artists, a lot of artists of the time, were actually heading to Rome to actually study the ancient works. So the fact that he's depicting a male nude and the fact that he's doing it in a contrapposto aspect does not become as any shock to most historians. So most historians do acknowledge that it could just be him depicting a young boy taking on an adult responsibility and nothing else because of that classical upbringing that most Florentines actually took on, most Italian artists actually did. Almost all Italian artists would actually journey to Rome to study a bit. And now this actual sort of studying in Rome continues on throughout the ages. That doesn't really disappear. So this one in particular actually isn't looking so much at the human body, but it's actually just to demonstrate again what's going on during the time period. Now, Lorenzo Ghiberti was actually a very influential artist of this time, and this in particular is called the Gates of Paradise for the baptistry in Florence. Now, again, if you remember, Florence is pushing out a lot of artwork during the Renaissance time period, and the Gates of Paradise actually gets its name from supposedly Michelangelo. Now, Michelangelo is also in full parts, and we're going to go over him later on during the Renaissance time period and his depiction of David as well. But Lorenzo Ghiberti is not depicting David here. In fact, Lorenzo Ghiberti is depicting 10 stories taken from the Hebrew Bible. Now, this one in particular, it's going over a story that starts with Rebecca listening to God, warning her of her unborn sons, and it ends with Jacob receiving Isaac's blessing. Now, the really interesting thing that's going on here is that each part of this story goes from the foreground to the background, or vice versa, I should say. The little figures in the background are actually the start of the story, and as the figures come closer towards us, it becomes the ending of the story being told. So the entire story is actually depicted within this little square that we see. And he's using perspective to actually act as a time frame, which is really interesting because we haven't seen that before in reliefs. Most reliefs that we were looking at were actually very flat. So artists are not only looking at the human body, but now they're looking at perspective, and they're also looking at time. So here we see sort of a female nude. And by sort of a female nude, I mean she is a female nude. She's just also covering herself up in a very modest way. And actually, that's because Botticelli, the painter, again, Florence, he actually went to Rome and studied ancient Greek sculptures. And there was actually an ancient Greek sculpture of Venus, what they would have called Aphrodite, what the Romans called Venus. That was actually really, really commonly copied by the Romans. So the Romans kind of stole the gods and goddesses, and they also stole the sculptures depicting the gods and goddesses. And Botticelli, being a Florentine, he just kind of hopped on that Roman stealing and stole from the Romans. And he depicted it in this painting, and so the body that we're seeing here, the modest Venus or the birth of Venus, the way in which the body is portrayed is actually in a classical sense, even though this is very Renaissance. The whole style of the painting is very Renaissance. Her pose is actually in a classical pose, which sounds a little bit weird because she's almost leaning a little bit too much off of herself and isn't quite doing a contrapposto because there's not really that much of an S to begin with. The way in which her legs are folding isn't very stable or sturdy. But if you actually look at it, she is putting all of her weight on one leg and the other leg is bent. So what's actually occurring here is probably a slightly changed or altered version of the contrapposto coming into the painting. Andrea Mantegna, this in particular artist is very interesting because he painted Camera Picta, which is the painted room, and in particular the ceiling of this room is what really took off for what's known to be the ceilings of the Renaissance time period. And his in particular, it focuses on the illusion of perspective. So we've always been looking at one point perspective, which is to create the illusion of depth within a painting. And this one in particular, it does it with this beautifulness of foreshortening. Now, foreshortening was not used before this. All the other times, perspective was a one-point perspective, but it was always off in the horizon line. It was never actually behind in the center. So if you look at these bodies, it's actually a distortion of the body in order to create the illusion that it actually is anatomically accurate from your vantage point. So they were trying to depict accurate human bodies, realistic human bodies, studying the human body. And now that they've accomplished studying it, Now they're contorting it and manipulating it to their own means to look real, to create the illusion that it is realistic. Now it's using an accuracy to look more accurate. So, by this, what I mean is if you were to actually shift this body, one of the bodies that's foreshortened in this painting, it wouldn't appear very accurate if you were to shift it because the torso is very shortened and the legs are elongated, the feet are actually bigger than the head, and certain parts of the body are completely cut off. And the reason why they do this is because if you actually were to look down at your body, which you could do right now, you could look down on your body right now, you'll notice that when you look down, your chest is the first thing that you really see, and then as you look down, your feet appeared smaller. But in reality, if you were to take your foot closer to you, it's going to appear much larger. So that's why the feet are actually proportionally disproportionate. They're larger than the head, so that way it could create a more accurate false perspective. Since the feet, in theory, would be closer to us, they are larger to us. When you look at the torso and you look, not necessarily when you're looking down, well, necessarily when you're looking down too, certain parts of the torso get cut off. And that's because of the perspective vantage point. Which is why the torso is actually very shortened. He doesn't paint the entire torso, he paints a section of the torso that would be seen.